Universal language. A universal language is possible, only people will never develop it, because it was invented a long time ago. However, to understand this language, and to express ideas in it, depends not only upon one's knowledge of the language, but also on our level of being. There exists not one but three universal languages. The first of them can be written and spoken, while remaining within the limits of one's own language. The only difference is that when people speak in their ordinary language, they do not understand one another, however in this other language they do. In the second language, written language is the same for all people, like for example with figures or mathematical formulae. However, individuals still speak their own language, yet each of them understands the other even though the other speaks in an unknown tongue. The third language is the same for all, both the written and the spoken. The difference of language disappears altogether on this level. The matter therefore arises as to teaching, or rites within existing religions. Imagine a group of people sitting in a drawing room and the maid overhearing their conversation. She would of course understand everything in her own way and repeat what she has understood to the porter of the house. The porter would again understand the conversation in his own way, then go outside to repeat it to the coachman next door. The coachman then goes to the country and recounts in the village what the gentry talk about in town. The question can then be asked, do you think that what the coachman recounts to his relatives in the village will resemble what was spoken of in the drawing room before the maid? This is precisely the relationship between existing religions and that which was their basis. We receive teachings, traditions, prayers and rites not at fifth hand but at 25th hand, so that obviously everything will have been distorted beyond recognition, and everything essential long ago forgotten. For example, in all the denominations of Christianity a great part is played by the tradition of the Last Supper of Christ and his disciples. Liturgies and whole series of dogmas, rites and sacraments are based upon it. This has been a ground for schism, for the separation of churches and for the formation of sects. How many people have perished over the centuries because they did not accept this or that interpretation of it? Nobody, however, understands what this was exactly, or what Christ and his disciples did that evening. There exists no explanation that even approximately resembles the truth, because what is written in the Gospels has in the first place been distorted in its copying and translation. Then it was written for those who know. To those who do not know it can explain nothing, and the more they try to understand it, the deeper they are led into error. To understand what took place at the Last Supper it is necessary to firstly know certain laws. Returning briefly to what was previously noted about an astral body. People who have an astral body can communicate with one another at a distance, without having recourse to ordinary physical means. However, for such communication to be possible they must first establish some connection between them. For this purpose, when going to different places or different countries, people sometimes take with them something belonging to another, particularly things that have been in contact with the body and are permeated with its emanations and so on. In the same way, in order to maintain a connection with a dead person, friends used to keep objects that had belonged to the deceased. These things leave, as it were, a trace behind them, something like invisible wires or threads that remain stretched out through space-time. These threads connect a given object with the person, living, or in certain cases dead, to whom the object belonged. People have known this from the remotest antiquity, and have made various uses of the knowledge. Traces of it can be found among the customs of many cultures. We know, for example, that several nations have the custom of blood brotherhood. Two individuals or perhaps even several mix their blood together in the same cup and then drink from this cup, after which they are regarded as kin, by blood. The origin of this custom, however, lies far deeper. In its origin it was a magical ceremony for establishing a connection between astral bodies. Blood has special qualities, and certain people, for example Jews, ascribed a special significance or magical properties to blood. If a connection between astral bodies has been thus established, then again, according to the beliefs of certain nations, it is not broken by death. Christ knew that he must die. It had been decided beforehand. He knew it, and his disciples knew it, and each one knew what part they had to play. However, at the same time they wanted to establish a permanent link with Christ, and for this purpose he gave them his blood to drink, and his flesh to eat. It was not bread and wine at all, but real flesh and real blood. The Last Supper was a magical ceremony similar to blood brotherhood, for establishing a connection between astral bodies. However, who is there that knows about this in existing religion today, and who understands what it means? All this has been long forgotten, and everything given quite a different meaning. The words have remained, but their meaning has been lost. What therefore is the aim of any teaching? Are the aim of the pupil, and the aim of the teacher the same? It is important for each to establish their own aim, for the teaching by itself cannot pursue any definite aim. It can only show the best way for people to attain whatever aims they might have. The question of aim is therefore an important question, for until one has defined their own aim for themselves, they will not be able to even begin to do anything. How is it possible to do anything without having an aim? Before anything else, doing presupposes an aim. For example, the question of the aim of existence is one of the most difficult of all philosophical questions. People do not know it, and cannot know it for as long as they remain what they are, because there are not one but many aims of existence, and attempts to answer this question using ordinary methods are utterly hopeless or useless. What we need to examine therefore is our personal aim, what do we want to attain, and not to concern ourselves with the reason for our existence. Everyone must have his or her own aim. One might want riches, another health, a third desires the kingdom of heaven, while the fourth wants to be a general, and so on. It is about aims of this sort that we are inquiring. If one knows their aim, then it is possible to assess whether or not this aim coincides with that of esoteric work. One's aim could be to know the future, and after a theoretical study of the question, come to the realization that the future can be known, then devise experiments to prove this hypothesis. We ought, and have a right to know the future, and until we do know it, we shall not be able to organize our lives. A great deal is connected with this question. For example, one can know, and has a right to know exactly how much time is left to them. How much time they have at their disposal, or in other words they can and have a right to know the day and the hour of their demise. It is humiliating to live without knowing this, as what is the good of beginning any kind of work when one does not know whether one will have time to finish or not? Our personal aim can also vary a great deal. For example, we might like to be convinced that we go on existing after the death of the physical body. Whether or not this is dependent upon us working in order to exist after death. We may on the other hand not care to know the future, or whether we are certain or not of life after death. If we remain such as we are now, then what we might desire most of all is to be master of ourselves. Perhaps our aim would be to understand the teaching of Christ, and become a Christian in the true sense of the term. Be able to help people, know how to achieve world peace, and so on. The best formulation of aim, however, is the desire to be one's own master, as without this nothing else is possible, and without this nothing else will have value. Let us however examine the first aim written above. In order to know the future, it is necessary to know the present in all its details as well as to know the past. Today is what it is, because yesterday was what it was. If today is like yesterday, then tomorrow will be like today. If you want tomorrow to be different, then you must make today different. If today is simply a consequence of yesterday, then tomorrow will be a consequence of today in exactly the same manner. If one has studied thoroughly what happened yesterday, the day before yesterday, and a week ago, a year or 10 years ago, then they can unmistakably say what will and what will not happen tomorrow. At present we lack sufficient material to discuss this question. However, what happens or may happen to us depends upon three causes: upon accident, upon fate, and upon our own will. Such as we are almost wholly dependent upon the law of accident. We have no fate in the real sense of the word, any more than we can have will. If we had will, then through this alone we would know the future, because then we could make our future, and make it such as we want it to be. If we had fate, we could also know the future, because fate corresponds to type. If type is known, then its fate can be known, that is both the past and the future. Accidents, on the contrary, cannot be foreseen. Today a person is one, tomorrow they are different. Today one thing happens to them, tomorrow another. Are we able to foresee what is going to happen to each of us? That is to say, foretell what result each of us will reach in work upon themselves, and whether it is worth our while to begin work in the first place. It must be accepted that one can only foretell the future for men. It is impossible to foretell the future for man-machine. Their direction changes at every moment. In one moment a machine of this kind is going in one direction, and you can calculate where it could get to, but 5 minutes later it is already going in quite a different direction, and all your calculations prove to be wrong. Therefore, before talking about knowing the future, one must know whose future is meant. If a person wants to know their own future, then they must first of all know themselves. Then they will see whether it is worth their while to know the future. Sometimes, they may even prefer not to know it. It sounds paradoxical, but we have every right to say that we know our future. It will be exactly the same as our past has been. Nothing can change of itself. In practice, in order to study the future, one must learn to notice and to remember the moments when we really know the future, and when we act in accordance with this knowledge. Thus, judging by results, it will be possible to demonstrate that we really do know the future. This happens in a simple way in business, for example. Every good commercial business entrepreneur knows the future. If they do not know the future, then their business goes smash. In work on oneself, one must be a good business entrepreneur, a shrewd merchant, and knowing the future is only worthwhile when one can be their own master. The question of a future life is therefore raised, about how to create one and to avoid final death, or at least how not to die. For this it is necessary to be. If a person is changing every minute, if there is nothing in them that can withstand external influences, then this means that there is nothing in them that can withstand death. However, if they become independent of external influences, if there appears in them something that can live by itself, then this something may not die. In ordinary circumstances we die in every moment. External influences change and we change with them, that is, many of our eyes die. If a person develops in themselves a permanent eye that can survive a change in external conditions, then it can survive the death of the physical body. The whole secret is that one cannot work for a future life without working the one that they already have. In working for life one works for death, or rather for immortality. Therefore work for immortality, if one may so call it, cannot be separated from general work. In attaining the one an individual attains the other. A person must strive to be, simply for the sake of their own life's interests, and through this alone they may become immortal. We do not speak specifically of a future life, nor do we study whether it exists or not, because the laws are everywhere the same. In studying our own life as we know it, and the lives of others, from birth to death, a person is studying all the laws that govern life, death and immortality. If they become the master of their own life, then they may become the master of their death. The other aim hypothesized was how to become a Christian. It is necessary first to understand that a Christian is not a person who calls themselves a Christian, or whom others call a Christian. A Christian is one who lives in accordance with Christ's precepts. Such as we are, we cannot be Christians. In order to be Christian we must be able to do. We cannot do, for with us everything just happen. Christ says, "Love your enemies," but how can we love our enemies when we cannot even love our friends? Sometimes it loves, and sometimes it does not love. Such as we are, we cannot even desire to be Christian because again, sometimes it desires and sometimes it does not desire. One and the same thing cannot be desired for long, because suddenly instead of desiring to be a Christian, a person remembers a very good but expensive car that they have seen. Then instead of desiring to be a Christian, they begin to think about how they can obtain that automobile, forgetting all about Christianity. Or if somebody else does not believe what a wonderful Christian they are, they will then be ready to eat them alive, or to roast them on hot coals. In order to be a good Christian one must be. To be means to be master of oneself. If a person is not their own master, they have nothing and can have nothing, therefore cannot be a Christian. They are simply a machine, an automaton, and a machine cannot be a Christian. Think for a moment if it is possible for a motor vehicle, or even a computer to be a Christian, for a robot to be a Christian? They are simply things that are controlled by chance, and not responsible because they are machines. To be a Christian means to be responsible, and responsibility only comes later, when a person even partially ceases to be a machine, and begins in fact, not only in words, to desire to be a Christian. The relationship between the work that is discussed and Christianity as it is widely known, depends upon what is known about Christianity. It would be necessary to talk a great deal and for a long time about what is understood by this term, however what can be stated is that this work can be described as esoteric Christianity. The meaning of these words will be examined in due course, however for the moment we shall continue to examine personal aims. Of the aims set out above, the one most apt is the desire to be master of oneself, because without this nothing else is possible, and in comparison with this desire all other desires are simply childish dreams. Desires of which an individual could make no use, even if they were to be granted by some magical genie in a bottle, if for example one's stated aim was to help people. In order to help people one must first learn to help themselves. A great number of people become absorbed in thoughts and feelings about helping others, simply out of laziness, which is transference. They are simply too lazy to work on themselves, and at the same time it is very pleasant for them to think that they are able to help others. This is being false and insincere with oneself. If a person looks at themselves as they really are, then they will not begin to think of helping other people. They will be too ashamed to even think about it. Love of mankind or altruism are very fine words, but only have meaning when a person is able, of their own choice, and of their own volition, to love or not to love. To be an altruist or an egoist, and only then does their choice have value. If however there is no choice at all, if they cannot be different, if they are only such as chance has made or is making them, an altruist today and an egoist tomorrow, again an altruist the day after tomorrow, then there is no value in it whatsoever. In order to help others, one must first learn to be an egoist, a conscious egoist, because only a conscious egoist can help people. Such as we are, we can do nothing. A person decides to be an egoist, but gives away their last shirt instead. They decide to give away their last shirt, but instead strip the last shirt off the very person to whom they meant to give their own. Or they decide to give away their own shirt, but instead give away someone else's, and are offended if somebody refuses to give them their last shirt so they can pass it to another. This is what happens most often, and it goes on. Above all, in order to do what is difficult, one must first learn to do what is easy. You cannot begin with the most difficult. How, for example, do we stop war? Wars cannot be stopped, and there will be no world peace. War is the result of the slavery in which people live. Strictly speaking, people are not to blame for war, because war is due to cosmic forces, to planetary influences. However, in humanity there is no resistance at all against influences, and there cannot be any because we are all slaves. If we were men, and capable of doing, then we would be able to resist these influences, and to refrain from killing one another. If a certain number of individuals were to realize this fact, if a sufficient number of them came to a definite conclusion that there should be no war, could they then influence others? The answer to this question is written throughout the pages of history. Those who dislike war have been trying to stop war almost since the creation of the world, and yet the 20th century saw 2 world wars. War is not decreasing, it is increasing, and war cannot be stopped by ordinary means. All theories about universal peace, about peace conferences and the United Nations, are again simple laziness and hypocrisy. People do not want to think about themselves, do not want to work upon themselves, but think of how to make others do what they want instead. If a sufficient number of people who wanted to stop war really did gather together, they would first of all begin by making war on those who disagreed with them. It is even more likely they would make war on people who also want to stop wars, but in a different way, and they would therefore fight. We are what we are, and cannot be different. War has many causes that are unknown to us. Some causes lie in humanity itself, and others are outside of it. One must therefore begin with the causes that are in themselves. How can we be independent of the external influences of great cosmic force, when we are the pawns of everything that surrounds us? We are controlled by everything around us. If we became free from things, then we'd become free from planetary influences. Freedom, liberation. This must be the aim of humankind. To become free and to be liberated from slavery. This is what a person ought to strive for, when they become even semi-conscious of their own position. There is nothing else for us as long as we remain a slave both inwardly and outwardly. However, we cannot cease to be a slave outwardly whilst we remain a slave inwardly. In order to become free, an individual must first gain inner freedom. The reason for our inner slavery is our ignorance, and above all our ignorance of ourselves. Without self-knowledge, without understanding the working and functions of our own mechanisms, we cannot be free and we cannot govern ourselves. We will always be manipulated, and a plaything of the forces acting upon us. This is why in all ancient teachings, the first demand at the beginning of liberation was, know thyself. We shall speak of these words next.